Inside the black community, they for the most part recognize and talk about encounters of racism and the adverse effect of racism on even-handed access to assets, including human services, training, lodging, etc. They less much of the time talk about the negative effect racism regularly has on their mental health. In this video, we cause to notice the connection between encounters of racism and mental health, with a particular spotlight on anxiety disorders and indications, which are among the most regularly analyzed mental health issue in the United States. We additionally examine adapting techniques that might be helpful even with encounters of racism. Emphasize that Black Americans are not in any way answerable for the presence or experience of racism and unjustifiably are troubled with the duty of adapting to the difficult presence of these harsh encounters. Prejudice is a genuine, common issue in the United States, and there is a connection between racism and stress, anxiety, and other physical, mental and health issues. Broadly delegate surveys and studies have demonstrated that the larger part of Black Americans consider racism to be being, across the board, in the United States, 78%. Portray racism as an intense or major issue, 87%. Accept that blacks experience racism in the United States, 88%. Bigotry can take on numerous structures including racial macroaggressions, which are depicted as increasingly clear racist encounters including being known as a racial or ethnic slur, being genuinely attacked because of race, or being denied reasonable wages because of race. Racial microaggressions are depicted as inconspicuous, purposeful or inadvertent insults that slander or debase people of shading because of race. Instances of microaggressions incorporate suppositions of mediocrity or guiltiness because of race, not having individuals who seem as though they spoke to in work, instructive, or legislative settings, being informed that they talk about race or racism to an extreme, and suspicions of similarity because of race. Likewise, racism can be experienced on the basic and institutional level, for instance, voter disappointment, and on the individual level, for instance, a manager being astonished that they are astute or articulate. Around 1 of every 4 Black Americans will encounter an anxiety disorder sooner or later. Social anxiety disorder is the most well-known anxiety disorder, with a lifetime commonness of 10.8% among blacks, trailed by generalized anxiety disorder 5.1%, panic disorder 3.1%, and obsessive-compulsive disorder 3%. Furthermore, anxiety is progressively diligent. For instance, manifestations last longer in Black Americans when contrasted with white Americans. In any case, Black Americans look for mental health treatment significantly less regularly or potentially drop out of mental health treatment before the suggested portion of treatment, all the more frequently contrasted with white Americans. How do racism and anxiety correlate? Notwithstanding encountering racism at all levels as often as possible, we realize that these encounters have huge negative consequences for both physical and mental health results for Black Americans. A few analysts have proposed that interminable encounters of racism and microaggressions bring about racial battle exhaustion, which incorporates expanded heart rate and blood weight, anxiety and stress, migraines, hyper-carefulness, and other physical and mental side effects. While the negative effect of racism on mental health is unavoidable and sweeping, these investigations recommend a connection between racism and side effects related to anxiety. There are 3 explicit ways we consider encounters prejudice adversely sway stress and anxiety for Black Americans. Evasion of esteemed activity. Internalizing. An impression of the absence of control. Encounters of racism may add to stress and anxiety for Black Americans through evasion of the things that are generally important in our lives. Wilson and Murrell depict the manners in which that both evasions of our feelings and shirking of important settings add to the upkeep of stress and anxiety. In particular, we are instructed that positive emotions are acceptable and that negative emotions are terrible. For example, a young man who cries since he gets thumped over at football practice is known as a baby. A grown-up who is left behind for an opening for work is advised to not think about it literally or to get over it. The hidden supposition that will be that we should smother, dispose of, or supplant contrary emotions with certainty, confidence, or positive thinking so as to travel through our lives and do the things that are by and by significant. In any case, a bounty of writing archives the dumbfounding impacts of endeavors to control our emotional encounters, featuring that avoidant adapting, for example, pushing our sentiments aside or imagining that encounters of racism don't do any harm or adversely influence us, predicts less fortunate long-term mental health results. The things that issue to us, our qualities, become constrained when the emphasis is exclusively on endeavors to abstain from upsetting emotions. In addition, negative life occasions, for instance, prejudice, can make unbending and resolute methods of reacting that limit our capacity to take part in the things that are important to us. For example, a person who encounters social anxiety may start to evade places where she will interface with others since she wouldn't like to encounter anxiety. Be that as it may, her evasion of spots where she may communicate with others is in direct differentiation to her estimation of making social associations with others and finding an actual existence accomplice. With regards to racism, visit encounters of discrimination have been related to manifestations of anxiety including raised blood pressure and heart rate, stress, and basic and negative self-centered considerations. Encounters of racism have additionally been related to disguised racism and negative self-assessments, which may likewise add to the turn of events and support of stress and anxiety for Black Americans. While not every single Black American experienced disguised racism, Williams and Williams-Morris affirm that Black people may disguise convictions of racial inadequacy conveyed by the dominant part about them, also called disguised racism. Disguised racism is characterized as the cognizant or oblivious acknowledgement, by the minimized gathering, of negative and basic convictions about one's worth. This can show in various manners, however. One model is the conviction that having softer hair or lighter skin is more delightful and has more an incentive than coarser hair textures and darker skin complexions. Numerous investigations have seen disguised racism as connected to poor confidence and more elevated levels of mental trouble. Furthermore, we know through research and clinical introductions that basic convictions about oneself and negative self-centered contemplations are related with the turn of events and upkeep of anxiety symptoms. This focuses on the huge effect of the negative and inescapable messages about the value of Black Americans in our general public that we see from the media, see reflected in political figures, and find in the low prosecution and conviction rates for police savagery against Black Americans. Besides, the disguise of these negative convictions can make sentiments of defenselessness, uselessness, pity, dread, and disgrace. A person's impression of command over life settings, well-being, and condition is legitimately connected to stress and anxiety. Dark people are not liable for their encounters of racism, and they have practically nothing, assuming any, command about whether or not they experience racism. In this way, with regards to racism, racist encounters can inspire a reasonable impression of the absence of control of one's condition, in this way adding to the turn of events and upkeep of stress and anxiety. In particular, Black Americans strive to accommodate themselves, their families, live as per their own qualities and cultural desires, and hope to get fair treatment, nobility, and regard because of this difficult work. This endeavor at controlling one's condition through difficult work and acting in accordance with society's desires has been portrayed as John Henryism. Scholars have portrayed John Henryism as the estimation of difficult work and assurance even with extraordinary and overpowering chances or model prejudice and abuse. In spite of difficult work, assurance, and steadiness, the recognition that they can't control their own security and ecological settings is started and kept up by the recurrence of racist encounters. In particular, the desire that difficult work, assurance, and living as indicated by society's principles will prompt reasonable treatment is consistently broken by encounters of racism. Approaches to manage racial oppression. Sympathy for one's self. As recently talked about, feelings give us significant data and assist us with adjusting to the existing challenges that racism may evoke. Notwithstanding, social and cultural standards regularly disclose to us that feeling anxiety, trouble, or outrage are indications of shortcoming or proof of having an absence of discretion. Indeed, Black people who experience racism and emotional responses to racism, they are frequently informed that they are blowing up or excessively touchy, which propagates the self-impression of feeling as a shortcoming or as being wild. In particular, when they experience emotional responses notwithstanding racism, they can intentionally work on being humane with themselves and perceiving that the anxiety, outrage, misery, etc., that emerges is a justifiable response during and in the wake of these excruciating encounters. Self-empathy is portrayed as the valuation for our enthusiastic reactions to racism as being justifiable, normal, and part of the human experience. The work here is developing attention to our propensity to judge our emotional responses in light of racism and carrying self-empathy to both the emotional encounters and the judgment or self-analysis that may likewise emerge. For instance, even with a racist encounter, a Black woman can recognize that she is furious and value that this outrage is a characteristic and reasonable reaction to an uncalled-for circumstance as opposed to review her emotional reaction as being nonsensical or something to get over. Esteemed living. One conceivably successful system for reacting to encounters of racism and for fighting racism's consequences for anxiety manifestations is the job of taking care of and settling on decisions dependent on our qualities, for instance, the things that are significant and matter to a person. At the point when people can recognize and comprehend their qualities, they can be progressively mindful of what makes a difference to them during stressful minutes, settle on decisions steady with their qualities, and follow up on these decisions. For instance, during a stressful experience, it is very hard for people to recall that they have options in their lives and that they can encounter strengthening notwithstanding confined, critical contemplations. For example, I must choose the option to simply permit my manager to direct racist sentiments toward me since I will lose my employment, or I ought to have the option to deal with myself and not feel upset when my counsel questions my capacities. For Black Americans, specifically, reconnecting to qualities can be engaging to such an extent that settling on decisions can feel characteristic, even despite racism. For instance, the person who encounters trouble from his manager's racist jokes may decide to reconnect to his estimation of regard and may choose to move toward his supervisor about the racist remarks on the grounds that basically tolerating these remarks would be carrying on with an actual existence conflicting with what his identity is and a big motivator for him. A Black woman who sees that she is being dealt with unjustifiably in school by her counsel since she is Black might have the option to reconnect with what is important to her about being an understudy and settle on a choice to keep on participating in her benefit of seeking after her instruction even with this discrimination. She may choose to report this to the dean as well as search out an increasingly accommodating consultant, which is predictable with her benefit of seeking after education. She may likewise conclude that social connectedness amidst discrimination is a significant worth and start to create safe spaces with partners or different understudies to earn social help and procedure these encounters. Her choice of acting in accordance with her qualities notwithstanding these agonizing and unjustifiable encounters may cradle a portion of the stress related with racism. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more tips, information, and advice from Wellness World.